It was a typical Friday evening, nothing out of the ordinary, or so I thought. I had just finished another long week at work, and all I wanted was to kick back and relax. My name is Melissa, by the way. I'm 24, and I still live at home with my dad. We're pretty close, even though we've had our ups and downs over the years. He's been my rock since my mom passed away when I was 15. That night, I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, when I heard the front door open. My dad walked in, and to my surprise, he wasn't alone. "Hey, Melissa," he called out, "I've brought Jack over. We're going to have a few beers and talk shop." Jack. Jack was my dad's coworker at the car repair shop they both worked at. He was 27, tall, and had that rugged, grease-under-the-nails look that somehow suited him. I'd met him a few times before, but we'd never really spoken much. He always seemed quiet, almost brooding, and there was something about him that intrigued me. "Hi, Jack," I said as casually as I could, trying not to let on that my heart skipped a beat just seeing him there. He nodded in my direction, giving me a quick, almost shy smile before turning back to my dad. The three of us ended up eating dinner together. The conversation flowed easily between them, mostly about work and cars, things I didn't know much about. But every now and then, I'd catch Jack glancing at me from across the table. His eyes would linger just a bit too long before he looked away, and every time, I felt a strange flutter in my stomach. I wasn't sure what to make of it. After dinner, they headed to the living room with a couple of beers. I decided to take a shower and call it a night. As I stood under the warm water, I couldn't help but think about Jack. What was it about him that had me so captivated? I barely knew him, yet here I was, daydreaming about what it might be like to get closer to him. I shook the thoughts out of my head and finished my shower. I put on my pajamas and slid into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin. It was one of those nights where sleep wouldn't come easily. My mind was still racing, replaying every glance, every subtle interaction from dinner. It was ridiculous, really. He was just my dad's coworker, nothing more. At some point, I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a soft creak. My room was dimly lit by the moonlight filtering through the curtains, and for a moment, I thought I was imagining things. But then I saw the silhouette of someone standing by the door. My heart jumped into my throat as I realized it was Jack. "Jack?" I whispered, barely able to believe my eyes. "Shoo," he hushed me softly as he stepped closer. "I didn't mean to wake you." I was frozen, not out of fear but out of sheer disbelief. My thoughts were a jumbled mess. What was he doing here? What did he want? But then I noticed the look in his eyes, that same intensity I'd seen earlier at dinner. It was like he was searching for something in me, something he hadn't found in anyone else. He moved closer until he was standing right next to the bed. I could feel the heat radiating off him, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. He reached out slowly, his hand brushing against my arm, sending a shiver down my spine. "Melissa," he whispered, his voice thick with something I couldn't quite place. Desire? Longing? I wasn't sure, but whatever it was drawing me in, pulling me toward him like a magnet. I didn't know what came over me, but I found myself turning toward him, my breath catching in my throat. The next thing I knew, our lips were inches apart, and then, just like that, we were kissing. It was slow at first, tentative, but then it deepened, growing more urgent with every passing second. My hands tangled in his hair, pulling him closer as I lost myself in the moment. The world outside my room didn't exist anymore. It was just us, and the intensity of what was happening between us. But even in the midst of it, there was this tiny voice in the back of my mind, a voice that kept asking, "What are you doing? This is crazy." But I ignored it. I was too far gone, too wrapped up in the heat of the moment to care about the consequences. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathing heavily, and I could see the same confusion in his eyes that I felt. "We shouldn't be doing this," I whispered, though my body was betraying me, wanting nothing more than to pull him back to me. "I know," he said, his voice barely audible. "But I can't stop thinking about you, Melissa. Ever since the first time I saw you. I didn't know what to say. I wasn't sure what to think. All I knew was that I felt something for him, something I hadn't felt in a long time. But this was wrong, wasn't it? He was my dad's friend, his coworker. This wasn't supposed to happen. I should go, he said, pulling away reluctantly. I nodded, but part of me didn't want him to leave. Part of me wanted to keep this going, to see where it might lead. But I knew better. This was dangerous territory, and we were playing with fire. After he left, I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, my mind spinning. What had just happened? Was this the beginning of something, or was it just a one-time thing, a mistake that we'd both regret in the morning? The next few days were a blur. Jack and my dad worked together as usual, and I tried to go about my life as if nothing had happened. But every time I saw him, every time our eyes met, I felt that same pull, that same desire that had consumed me that night. Eventually, we couldn't resist each other. We started seeing each other in secret, sneaking around behind my dad's back. It was exhilarating and terrifying at the same time. Every time we met, the risk of getting caught hung over us like a dark cloud, but that only seemed to make it more intense, more thrilling. But we both knew we couldn't keep this up forever. We couldn't live in the shadows, pretending like nothing was going on. It wasn't fair to my dad, and it wasn't fair to us. We had to come clean, to tell him the truth, no matter how much it hurt. One evening, after weeks of sneaking around, Jack and I sat down and talked about it. We have to tell him, I said, my voice trembling with fear and anticipation. I know, Jack replied, taking my hand in his. But we have to be prepared for whatever happens. He's not going to take this well, Melissa. I know, I whispered, my heart heavy with the weight of what we were about to do. But we can't keep lying to him. The next day, we decided to tell him. Jack came over as usual, but this time, there was no beer, no talking shop. Instead, we sat down in the living room, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. Dad, I began, my voice shaky. There's something we need to talk to you about. He looked at me, then at Jack, his brow furrowing in confusion. What's going on? Jack cleared his throat, his hand tightening around mine. Sir, Melissa and I, we've been seeing each other. There was a long, heavy silence. My dad just stared at us, his face slowly turning from confusion to anger. You what? He finally said, his voice low and dangerous. We didn't plan this, I said quickly, trying to make him understand. It just happened. His eyes flashed with rage as he stood up, towering over us. How long? He demanded, his voice shaking with barely contained fury. Dad, please, I pleaded, but he wasn't listening. How long, Melissa? He repeated, his voice rising. A few weeks, I admitted, my heart pounding in my chest. He turned to Jack, his fists clenched at his sides. You've been sneaking around with my daughter behind my back? Jack stood up, trying to stay calm. Sir, I care about Melissa. This isn't just some fling. Get out, my dad said, his voice low and dangerous. Dad, please, just listen. I said, get out, he roared, pointing to the door. Jack hesitated, looking at me, but I knew there was no point in arguing. I nodded at him, and he reluctantly left, leaving me alone with my dad. I'd never seen him so angry, so betrayed. How could you do this to me, Melissa? He demanded, his voice thick with emotion. After everything we've been through? I didn't mean for this to happen, I said, tears streaming down my face. But I care about him, Dad. I really do. He shook his head, his face a mask of pain and disbelief. You don't understand what you've done, Melissa, he said quietly, his voice trembling. Jack is like family to me. We've worked side by side for years. I trusted him. And you? His voice broke, and he turned away, rubbing his face as if trying to erase the image of us together from his mind. I'm sorry, Dad, I whispered, feeling a knot tighten in my chest. I hated seeing him like this, so hurt and betrayed. But what could I do? The truth was out, and there was no taking it back. I never wanted to hurt you. For a moment, the room was silent, save for the heavy, uneven breathing of my father. I could see the gears turning in his head, his mind racing to process everything that had just been laid out before him. Then, suddenly, he turned back to me, his eyes narrowing. "Is this just a fling to you?" he demanded. "Or do you actually think there's something real between you and Jack?" I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "It's not a fling, Dad. I think I might love him." The words hung in the air, and as soon as they left my mouth, I knew they were true. I hadn't wanted to admit it, not even to myself, but there it was. I was in love with Jack. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. My dad stared at me, his expression hardening. "You're too young to know what love is," he said, his voice cold. "This is just some stupid infatuation. You don't know Jack like I do." I felt a surge of anger at his dismissive tone. "I'm not a child, Dad," I snapped. "I know what I feel. And I know Jack isn't perfect, but he's not the monster you're making him out to be." He shook his head again, as if trying to shake off the words I was saying. "You're wrong, Melissa. You don't know what you're getting yourself into." "I know enough," I shot back, my voice rising. "I know that I care about him, and he cares about me. And I'm not going to just walk away from that because you can't handle it." The words were out before I could stop them, and I instantly regretted them. My dad's face went pale, and for a moment, I thought he might explode. But instead, he just looked at me with a kind of resigned sadness, as if he'd already lost the battle before it had even begun. "Fine," he said quietly. "If that's how you feel, then there's nothing more to say." I opened my mouth to respond, but he was already walking away, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The door to his room closed behind him with a heavy thud, leaving me standing there alone, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do, what to say, or how to make things right. All I knew was that I was caught in the middle of a situation that was spiraling out of control, and there was no clear way out. That night, I didn't sleep much. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the conversation with my dad over and over again. Every word felt like a dagger to my heart, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just lost something precious, something I might never get back. Around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling me out of my thoughts. It was a text from Jack. "Are you okay?" I stared at the screen for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Was I okay? No, not really. But I didn't want to dump all my problems on him, not when he was probably dealing with his own guilt and confusion. "Not really. Dad's not taking it well." The reply came almost immediately. "I'm so sorry, Melissa. I never wanted to come between you and your dad." "It's not your fault," I typed back, feeling a lump form in my throat. We both knew this wouldn't be easy. There was a long pause before his next message came through. "I wish things were different. I wish we didn't have to hide." "Me too." We texted back and forth for a while, sharing our fears and frustrations, trying to make sense of the mess we were in. But no matter how much we talked, there was no simple solution. We both knew that. The only thing we could do was face the situation head-on and hope for the best. As the sun began to rise, I finally drifted off to sleep, Jack's last message still lingering in my mind. "I love you, Melissa. No matter what happens, I want you to know that." I didn't reply, not because I didn't feel the same way, but because I was too scared to admit it out loud. Saying it would make it real, and real meant facing the consequences. The next few days were a nightmare. My dad barely spoke to me, and when he did, it was short and curt, like he was forcing himself to be civil. The tension in the house was suffocating, and I found myself avoiding home as much as possible, just to escape the silent judgment that hung in the air. Jack tried to keep things normal at work, but it was clear that my dad was still furious. They spoke only when necessary, and the easy camaraderie they once shared was gone, replaced by a cold, professional distance. One evening, after another long day of avoiding each other, I came home to find my dad sitting at the kitchen table, a bottle of whiskey in front of him. He looked up as I entered, his eyes red and tired. "Melissa," he said, his voice slurred from the alcohol. "We need to talk." I hesitated, unsure if this was a good idea, but I knew we couldn't keep avoiding the elephant in the room. I sat down across from him, bracing myself for whatever was about to come. "I've been thinking a lot," he began, staring down at his glass. "About you and Jack. About everything." I didn't say anything, just waited for him to continue. "I don't like this," he said after a long pause. "I don't like it one bit. But, you're my daughter, and I don't want to lose you." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. I'd been so caught up in my own feelings that I hadn't considered how much this was hurting him, how much he was struggling with the idea of me being with someone he saw as a brother. "I love you, Dad," I whispered, my voice shaking. "And I don't want to lose you either. But I can't just walk away from Jack. I care about him too much." He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I know, kiddo. I know. But this is going to take some time for me to get used to. A lot of time." "I understand," I said, reaching across the table to take his hand. "And I'm not asking you to be okay with it right away. I just want you to know that I'm serious about him. This isn't just a phase." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation. "I hope you know what you're doing, Melissa. I really do." We sat there in silence for a while, just holding hands, both of us trying to come to terms with the new reality we were facing. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And for the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, we could get through this. The next few weeks were tense, but gradually, things began to improve. My dad was still distant, but he was trying, and that was all I could ask for. Jack and I continued to see each other, but we kept it low-key, not wanting to push my dad's patience too far. Then one evening, as I was getting ready for bed, something strange happened. I was in my room, scrolling through my phone, when I heard my dad's voice in the hallway. He was on the phone, his tone urgent and anxious. "No, I don't know who sent them," he was saying. "But I can't let this get out. It would ruin everything." I frowned, creeping closer to the door to listen. Who was he talking to? And what was he so worried about? "I don't care what it takes," he continued, his voice low. "Just find out who did this and make sure it doesn't go any further. I'll pay whatever it costs." My heart started to race as I listened. What was going on? Was my dad in some kind of trouble? I waited until I heard him hang up before stepping out into the hallway. He was standing there, staring at his phone with a troubled expression, and he jumped when he saw me. "Melissa," he said, trying to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "What are you doing up?" "I could ask you the same thing," I said, crossing my arms. "Who were you talking to?" "No one," he said quickly, too quickly. "Just a work thing. Nothing for you to worry about." "Dad," I said, narrowing my eyes. "I'm not a kid anymore. If something's going on, I have a right to know." He hesitated, clearly torn between telling me the truth and keeping me in the dark. Finally, he sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Fine," he said, his voice weary. "But you have to promise not to tell anyone, especially Jack." "Why would I tell Jack?" I asked, confused. He looked at me for a long moment, as if debating whether or not to say more. Then he pulled out his phone and opened an email, handing it to me. I took the phone, my eyes scanning the screen. The email was from an anonymous sender, with a subject line that made my blood run cold: "Your secrets exposed." I opened the email, my heart pounding. Inside were several attachments, each labeled with my dad's name. I clicked on the first one, and what I saw made me gasp. Photos. Dozens of them. Some were of my dad at work, talking to Jack and other employees. Others were more compromising. My dad in the back room of the shop, talking to a man I didn't recognize. My dad handing over an envelope stuffed with cash. My dad sitting in his car, looking around nervously before pulling out what looked like a small bag of drugs. "What is this?" I whispered, my hands shaking as I scrolled through the photos. "It's blackmail," my dad said quietly, taking the phone back from me. Someone's trying to destroy me, Melissa. If these photos get out, I could lose everything. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My dad, involved in something illegal? It didn't make sense. He'd always been so straight-laced, so by the book. But these photos didn't lie. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, my voice trembling. Why didn't you ask for help? I didn't want to drag you into this mess, he said, his face lined with stress and guilt. You've already been through so much, with your mom and everything. I didn't want to burden you with my problems too. Dad, I said, tears stinging my eyes. You should have told me. We're in this together, remember? We always have been. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. I know, kiddo. But this is dangerous. I don't want you getting hurt because of my mistakes. I shook my head, wiping away the tears that were now streaming down my face. We'll figure this out, Dad. We'll find out who's behind this and stop them. But you can't keep shutting me out. He nodded, pulling me into a tight hug. I'm sorry, Melissa. I'm so sorry. As I hugged him back, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread settle in the pit of my stomach. My dad was in trouble, and now, so was I. But I wasn't going to let whoever was behind this win. I'd protect my dad, no matter what it took. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of determination. I wasn't going to let this blackmailer ruin my dad's life. I needed to find out who was behind it, and I needed to do it fast. I knew I couldn't do it alone, though. I needed help, and there was only one person I could trust with something like this, Jack. After making sure my dad was out of the house, I texted Jack, asking him to meet me at a nearby cafe. He agreed, and within half an hour, we were sitting across from each other, a cup of coffee between us. What's going on? Jack asked, his brow furrowed with concern. You sounded really upset in your text. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. Jack, there's something I need to tell you. But you have to promise me you'll keep it between us. You can't tell my dad, no matter what. His eyes widened slightly, but he nodded. I promise. I pulled out my phone and showed him the photos from the email. As he scrolled through them, his expression shifted from confusion to shock to anger. Who the hell sent these? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. I don't know, I admitted. But whoever it is, they're trying to blackmail my dad. They're threatening to release these photos if he doesn't pay up. Jack sat back in his chair, his jaw clenched. This is bad, Melissa. Really bad. If these photos get out, your dad could lose everything. I know, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. That's why I need your help. We have to find out who's behind this and stop them. Jack was silent for a moment, his eyes scanning the photos again. Then he nodded, his expression determined. Okay. We'll figure this out. But we have to be careful. Whoever's doing this isn't messing around. I nodded, feeling a surge of relief. With Jack on my side, I knew we had a better chance of finding the blackmailer and stopping them before it was too late. We spent the next hour brainstorming ideas, trying to figure out who might have a grudge against my dad. We went over his past, his work relationships, even his personal life, but nothing seemed to fit. My dad wasn't the kind of person who made enemies easily, so the fact that someone was targeting him like this was baffling. Eventually, we decided to start by looking into the man in the photos with my dad. He was the only person in the pictures we didn't recognize, and it seemed like a good place to start. I'll ask around the shop, Jack said as we left the cafe. See if anyone recognizes this guy. Maybe we'll get lucky. Thanks, Jack, I said, giving him a small smile. I don't know what I'd do without you. He smiled back, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. We'll get through this, Melissa. I promise. Over the next few days, Jack did some digging at the shop, asking around about the man in the photos. It wasn't easy, he had to be discreet, not wanting to raise any suspicions. But finally, he got a lead. One of the older mechanics recognized the man. His name was Carl, and he used to work at the shop years ago, before Jack had even started. According to the mechanic, Carl had been fired under suspicious circumstances, something to do with stealing parts and selling them on the side. My dad had been the one to fire him, and from what the mechanic remembered, Carl hadn't taken it well. It was a start, but it wasn't enough. We needed to find Carl and figure out if he was the one behind the blackmail. But tracking him down wasn't going to be easy. He'd left town after getting fired, and no one at the shop knew where he'd gone. That's when Jack had an idea. "There's a guy I know," he said one evening as we sat in his car, going over everything we'd learned. "He's good at finding people. I could ask him to look into Carl, see if he's still around." I hesitated, not sure if we should be involving anyone else in this. But we were running out of options, and time was ticking. "Okay," I said finally. "Let's do it." Jack's friend, a private investigator named Ray, agreed to help. Within a few days, he had a lead. Carl was living in a small town a few hours away, working at a rundown garage. It wasn't much, but it was enough to go on. Jack and I decided to pay Carl a visit. We needed to know if he was the one behind the blackmail, and if he was, we needed to find a way to stop him. We drove out to the town one afternoon, the tension between us palpable. Neither of us knew what to expect, and the uncertainty was gnawing at my nerves. When we arrived at the garage, it was exactly what I'd imagined, a small, shabby place on the edge of town, with a few beat-up cars out front and a faded sign that looked like it hadn't been updated in years. We parked and got out, exchanging a look of determination before heading inside. The garage was dimly lit and smelled of oil and metal. A man was working on a car in the corner, his back to us. "Carl?" Jack called out, his voice steady. The man straightened up and turned around, wiping his hands on a dirty rag. He was in his late 40s, with graying hair and a hard, weathered face. His eyes narrowed as he saw us. "Who's asking?" he said, his tone gruff. "We just want to talk," Jack said, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. Carl eyed us suspiciously, but after a moment, he nodded toward a small office in the back. "In there." We followed him into the office, which was cluttered with papers and tools. Carl sat down behind a battered desk, gesturing for us to take the chairs in front of him. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone impatient. "We know you used to work at my dad's shop," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "And we know you were fired. We just want to know if you're the one sending those photos." Carl's expression didn't change, but I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, recognition, maybe, or guilt. "Photos? I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to us," Jack said, leaning forward. "We've seen the photos. We know someone's trying to blackmail her dad, and you're the only person who has a reason to do it." Carl's jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he was going to deny it again. But then he sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Okay, fine," he said. "Yeah, I sent the photos. But I'm not the one behind this. I was just doing a job." My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "I mean, someone paid me to get those photos and send them to your old man," Carl said, his voice bitter. "I needed the money, so I took the job. But I didn't know it was going to blow up like this." "Who hired you?" Jack demanded, his fists clenched. Carl hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't know. The guy never gave me a name. Just said he had a score to settle with your dad and needed my help." I exchanged a worried glance with Jack. This was worse than we thought. If Carl didn't know who was behind this, then we were back to square one. "Look," Carl said, his tone softening slightly. "I didn't want to hurt your dad, okay? I just needed the cash. But if you're smart, you'll stay out of this. Whoever's behind this, they're dangerous. I don't know what they're planning, but it's not good." We left the garage with more questions than answers. Carl had given us a lead, but it wasn't much. We still had no idea who was targeting my dad or why. But I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't going to back down. Whoever was behind this, I was going to find them. And when I did, they were going to regret ever messing with my family. The next few days were a blur of frustration and dead ends. Jack and I kept digging, but no matter where we looked, we couldn't find anything that pointed to the person behind the blackmail. It was like chasing a ghost. Then, one evening, I got a call that changed everything. It was from Ray, the private investigator Jack had hired. He'd been doing some digging of his own, and he'd finally found something. Something big. I tracked down a lead, Ray said, his voice crackling through the phone. I think I know who's behind this. My heart skipped a beat. Who? It's not good, Melissa, Ray said, his tone serious. I think you should come down to my office. We need to talk about this in person. I agreed, my mind racing. Who could it be? Someone from my dad's past? An old business rival? The possibilities were endless, and none of them were good. I called Jack and told him to meet me at Ray's office. When we arrived, Ray was waiting for us, a stack of papers spread out on his desk. I've been following the money, Ray said, gesturing to the documents. Whoever's behind this, they've been careful, but not careful enough. I found a payment that was made to Carl, the guy you talked to. It was routed through a series of shell companies, but I managed to trace it back to the source. He slid a paper across the desk toward us, and when I saw the name on it, my blood ran cold. It was someone I knew. Someone I'd never suspected in a million years. It was my mom. My mind went blank as I stared at the paper. This couldn't be right. There had to be some mistake. Are you sure? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ray nodded grimly. I triple-checked. The payments all lead back to her. She's the one pulling the strings. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My mom? The person who had walked out on us years ago, leaving my dad to pick up the pieces? It didn't make sense. Why would she do this? What could she possibly gain? Jack was silent beside me, his expression a mix of shock and anger. Why would she do this? He asked, echoing my thoughts. I don't know, Ray admitted. But I think you need to confront her. Find out what she's after. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My own mother, blackmailing my dad? The person I'd spent years trying to forget, now coming back into our lives to destroy everything? But as much as I didn't want to believe it, the evidence was there. And I knew I couldn't ignore it. With a heavy heart, I made the decision to confront her. Ray managed to find her address, and the next day, Jack and I drove out to the small, unassuming house where she was staying. The drive was tense, neither of us speaking much. I was too caught up in my thoughts, trying to piece together the fragments of my broken past. When we finally arrived, I took a deep breath and knocked on the door. A moment later, it opened, and there she was. My mom, looking older and more tired than I remembered, but still the same woman who had walked out on us all those years ago. Melissa, she said, her eyes widening in surprise. What are you doing here? I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. We need to talk, Mom. About Dad. And about what you've been doing. Her expression faltered, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it. But then she sighed, stepping aside to let us in. We sat down in her small living room, the tension thick in the air. I didn't know how to start, what to say. How do you confront your own mother about something like this? Finally, I just blurted it out. Why are you doing this, Mom? Why are you blackmailing Dad? She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and sadness. I didn't want it to come to this, Melissa. But I didn't have a choice. What do you mean? Jack asked, his tone sharp. She sighed, rubbing her temples. After I left your father, I fell into some bad situations. Made some bad decisions. I got involved with people I shouldn't have, people who don't take kindly to debts. I owed them a lot of money, and they were going to come after me if I didn't pay up. So you decided to extort your own husband? Jack said, his voice incredulous. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she said, her voice breaking. I just needed the money. I thought I could scare him into paying up, and that would be the end of it. But then things spiraled out of control. Why didn't you just ask for help? I asked, tears welling up in my eyes. Dad would have helped you, even after everything. She shook her head, her face lined with regret. I didn't think he'd care. After what I did, I didn't think he'd want anything to do with me. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. All this time, she'd been driven by fear and desperation, not realizing that the man she was targeting still cared about her, still wanted to help. What do we do now? Jack asked, his voice calm but firm. My mom looked at me, her eyes pleading. I'll turn myself in, if that's what you want. But please, Melissa, don't hate me. I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to be angry, to lash out at her for everything she'd done. But another part of me, a part one hadn't felt in years, just wanted to forgive her. To have my mom back, even if it was only for a little while. Finally, I spoke, my voice barely above a whisper. We'll figure this out, Mom. But you have to come clean. You have to make this right. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I will, Melissa. I promise. In the days that followed, my mom turned herself in, and the truth about the blackmail came to light. It wasn't easy, and there were still a lot of wounds to heal, but for the first time in years, I felt like we were on the path to recovery. My dad was devastated when he found out the truth, but he didn't press charges against my mom. Instead, he offered her help, just as I knew he would. It was a long road ahead, but I had hope that we could rebuild what had been broken. As for Jack and me, our relationship grew stronger through the ordeal. We'd been through so much together, and it had only brought us closer. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew we'd face it together. In the end, the truth had come out, and while it wasn't the happy ending I'd imagined, it was real. And that was enough for me. Months passed, and life slowly returned to a new kind of normal. My mom was getting help, my dad was rebuilding his life, and Jack and I were planning our future together. The blackmail scandal faded into the background, just another chapter in our family's complicated history. But it was a chapter that had brought us closer, forced us to confront our past and find a way to move forward. And as I looked toward the future, I knew one thing for sure, no matter what challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, as a family. Because in the end, that's all that really matters.